Welcome to Front Office Pros. Today, we're going to be going through our 2025 NFL mock draft.
Hike!
It's an exciting time in the NFL because we are officially in NFL draft week. We're only a few days before the first night of the NFL draft in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So Joe and I are going to take our shot at predicting what's going to be happening in the first round. You're going to get two mocks for the price of one for this episode. We're going to be going through 4 picks at a time. And Joe, why don't you start us off? We'll alternate between picks. Who do you have going at the number 1 overall pick for the Tennessee Titans?
All right. Well, number 1 overall, Steve. I think pretty much everyone's got it. I'm going with quarterback Cam Ward.
Well, not everybody, Joe. I've got quarterback Cam Ward as well. I'm just kidding.
Oh, okay.
How about number 2?
All right. At number 2, I've got the Cleveland Browns going with wide receiver / cornerback Travis Hunter.
Chalk so far, same for me. Quarterback, wide receiver, Travis Hunter from Colorado heading to the Cleveland Browns. So who do you got for number 3?
Yeah, number 3, I decided to go with Abdul Carter, edge from Penn State.
For those New York Giants, this is probably one of the more tricky picks, but I think at the end of the day, blue chips matter. We're going to talk about these guys, but I'm going to go with Abdul Carter, number 3 as well, to the New York Giants. Let's head over to number 4 for the Patriots. Who do you got?
Yeah, for the Patriots, the one guy I just keep hearing over and over again, it's a potential lock, and that's Will Campbell, offensive tackle from LSU.
All right, as well, we're going to be chalked the same way, Joe. I'm going with offensive tackle from LSU, Will Campbell, heading to the New England Patriots. So that's our picks 1 through 4. Nothing really too notable here, I think, to comment on. We may be able to just go right on to 5 through 8, but I'll give you some floor here to be able to talk about these picks. Anything really come up for you when you started putting your mock together?
Yeah, not really. Just, as I kept looking around, I mean, it almost seems like these top 4 picks are really locked in. And unless the Giants maybe have a change of heart and they decide to go with like Shedeur Sanders overtaking, Abdul Carter, or maybe, the Cleveland Browns don't take Travis Hunter, they end up taking Abdul Carter. I think it's kind of between those. Or unless Cleveland makes a decision to go quarterback. But I think it's more likely that Cleveland and the Giants take a player, one of these players, and, perhaps, do they try to get back into the first round at some point and then grab a quarterback in the second round?
Yeah. Do you think there's any thought that the Giants will take a quarterback at 3?
I think there could be some thought there, but at the end of the day, I think, although I honestly think they probably should go with Shedeur Sanders, just because it's like, is Abdul Carter really going to make him that much better to make him be a playoff team? No. Then if the answer is kind of no there, then you probably should just try to grab a quarterback, and they need somebody for the future.
See, that's interesting. I think that with Kayvon Thibodeau, I don't know. They're talking about maybe not picking up his 5th-year option.
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't?
Well, you know how I feel about Thibodeau. I don't think he's that good. I think the guy's been overrated since, he got drafted.
That's true. You have thought that way. But I think if that's the case, then Abdul Carter comes in and now it's him and Brian Burns.
Yeah, I get that. But do you really, whether or not you have Abdul Carter or not, do you really think that this year, like, that really helps the Giants? Like, are they really going to be that much more competing? I mean, let's face it, they got right now Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston on at the quarterback position. Like, what are they doing? They need somebody for the future.
Yeah, I think we might be talking about the Giants later on here. I think Abdul Carter is going to be the pick. The other thing is there's been talk about maybe Ashton Jeanty going to the Patriots, or possibly a different offensive tackle, Armand Membu from Missouri. But it seems like Will Campbell's the guy. I think you and I've been hearing the same things. That's why I felt like I had to lean that way.
Yeah, pretty much. I just think Mike Vrabel. I know there's been talk of Ashton Jeanty. Mike Vrabel is just an old school guy. I think he wants to build from the trenches, and tackle makes too much sense. I know, people do like Membel, and they have these tackles kind of ranked all over the board, but I just keep hearing time and time again, Campbell to the Patriots. It's almost a lock at this point.
All right, let's head over at 5 through 8. This is where I make it more interesting. Starting off with the Jaguars at 5.
Yeah, number 5, I've got them taking running back Ashton Jeanty with Boise State.
Ooh, spicing it up, Joe. And just for the record, for those who are listening and or watching to this, Joe and I do not know what each other is doing. So I'm just putting that out there right now. At number 5, I also have Ashton Genty going
Oh,
to the
interesting.
Jacksonville Jaguars. Yes. How about number 6 for the Raiders?
All right. At number 6 for the Raiders, I've got them going with defensive tackle Mason Graham out of Michigan.
I also have them going with defensive tackle Mason Graham and sticking with the pick. So far, so good, Joe. How about number 7 for the New York Jets?
Yep. Number 7 for the New York Jets, I've got them going with offensive tackle Armin Membu out of Missouri, as you mentioned earlier.
Man, oh man. At number 7, I also have offensive tackle Armand Membu going to the New York Jets. So right now, we're all the same here, 1 through 7.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised about that. I thought I might have a difference maker with Genty there at 5, but you had it as well. So,
all right, finishing out this group here, number 8, Carolina Panthers. Who do you got there?
yeah, at the end of the day, I think they do want to trade it. Not sure if they can have a trade partner. So I've got them sticking at 8 and taking linebacker Jalen Walker out of Georgia.
Man, oh man, number 8. I also have them stick with the pick and go in linebacker Jalen Walker from Georgia.
Wow.
Man, this is crazy. We did not compare notes at all. We did not talk about this beforehand. So it's pretty wild that you and I are the same here, 1 through 8.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever had, we've been doing the mocks here. I don't think we've ever had this much continuity, but it is just kind of is what the draft is, for these, this year just seems wild, like there could just be, some easy picks here.
Well, I was really tossing and turning between whether to put Ashton Genty with the Raiders or with the Jaguars.
Me as
There's
well.
been some late buzz with the Jaguars, and ultimately there's every draft there's like a whoa type of moment, like not expecting that. I feel like it might have been Peter Schrager, I think, who maybe alluded to the fact that the Jaguars somebody like mentioned like, oh, don't sleep on Genty going to the Jaguars. And some people, like from a fantasy perspective, well, they got Travis Etienne. Travis Etienne's at his 5th-year option. After that, he's a free agent. Tank Bigsby's not an all-around running back. Liam Cohen is an offensive guy. If he wants to take pressure off of Trevor Lawrence, drafting a guy like Genty, he's a blue chip prospect. He's probably, people will say he's a top 4 prospect in this draft, regardless of position. So to me, I felt like it made a lot of sense. And ultimately then, with the Raiders, they have a ton of needs. They get a blue chip guy in Mason Graham. And, I think the general manager there for the Raiders, Spizek?
Something
of that nature.
Is it Spytech?
Spytech, but they're a big believer in stacking that defensive line. Him next to Christian Wilkins with Max Crosby, that's a deadly combo.
It really is. Kind of Daniel Jeremiah during his conference was the one that kind of convinced me to Genty to the Jags, because he said he felt like Liam Cohen and this GM with the new regime, they wanted to make an exciting splash move, saying like
that's who it was
on their team.
Jeremiah,
Yeah, I could kind of see it. You mentioned him being the offensive guy, and I think just this past season, just seeing like what he was able to do at the running back position with like Bucky Irving and move him all around and utilize him. And I just think, Genty could be that one guy that maybe he just can't pass up.
Yeah, that's kind of my thoughts too. When it comes to Membu, I think it just makes too much sense. I mean, they drafted Olu-Fashanu. He's on the left side. Membu, they're saying, is more of a right tackle.
Correct.
Helps really solidify that offensive line. And you remember Aaron Glenn came from Detroit. They were a big believer in building up both lines, offense and defensive line. Really will help give them some. They got Tippmann in the middle, Elijah Vera Tucker. They're going to really bolster that offensive line. I think they're really going to give Justin Fields as good of a shot as he can to try to be a franchise guy. Hopefully he, for his sake and for the Jets' sake, hopefully he follows the retreads that before him, like Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, guys who couldn't make it in their first stop, but were able to do that once they were, given another opportunity.
Yeah, and I just I agree with you there, and I had the same thoughts. Aaron Glenn coming from the Detroit Lions, he got to witness, Dan Campbell building that thing up front, being, nasty, and I just, makes sense. They really need a right tackle to just solidify that offensive line, and Membu will do exactly that.
And I think, when it comes to Jalen Walker, I was between maybe going Tetairoa McMillan possibly with the Panthers because with
Yeah.
that receiver. I think you probably were too. But ultimately, there's just too much buzz coming out about how the Panthers love this guy and his versatility. And it's not a coincidence that you hear these draft people because they have their sources. They can't let the
Yeah.
cat out of the bag. But be like, this guy is an unbelievable character and he's hot and he's not going to leave the top 10. You want to know why he's not leaving the top 10? Because they know somebody in the top 10 that says that they're going to take him if
Right.
he's there. So to me, everything I'm hearing, it seems like that's a slam dunk that's what they're doing for the Panthers. Did you hear
Yeah.
the same thing?
Yeah, I was. And, I did, I was toying with the idea of a wide receiver there too. But then, like you said, just everyone's talking about Jalen Walker and how much the Panthers love him. And it seems like it's set in stone as well that even though like Daniel Jeremiah did allude to the fact that they do want to trade down, I just don't know like who's coming up. I mean, to take somebody. I mean, unless maybe it's the Steelers to get ahead of the Saints with the new buzz with Derek Carr that they might take a quarterback. But at the end of the day, I'm just I don't know if anyone's really going to be willing to do that. So Walker just made sense.
That's a great segue to head over to the New Orleans Saints at number 9 as we go through our next 4 picks here. This is where I think you and I are going to go different, but let's find out.
Yeah, I think so. All right, so I've got the New Orleans Saints taking a quarterback, and I went with quarterback Jackson Dart out of Ole Miss.
Okay. At number 9, I went with wide receiver Matthew Golden out of Texas. How about number 10 for you for the Chicago Bears?
Yeah, 10, I ended up going with tight end Tyler Warren out of Penn State.
I also went with tight end Tyler Warren out of Penn State for the Chicago Bears. How about number 11 for the 49ers?
And number 11, I went with cornerback Will Johnson from Michigan for the 49ers.
Interesting. I went with defensive tackle Walter Nolan out of Ole Miss for the 49ers. And lastly, how about them Cowboys?
Yeah, Cowboys, everyone's mocking them, wide receivers and everything else, but you listen to Stephen Jones talk, seems like they might want to bolster that offensive line. So I went with Gray Zabel, offensive guard out of North Dakota State.
Oh, wow. I'm going to go with Omarion Hampton, running back out of North Carolina, heading to Dallas. So for the most part, you and I had some differences here in this grouping. Let's go team by team. So first we've got the New Orleans Saints. You went with Jackson Dart. I went with Matthew Golden. Most people are thinking it might be Shedeur Sanders. You ended up going with Dart. Why?
I just don't know if Shedeur Sanders I don't know if he fits the best with what Kellen Moore likes to do. And Kellen Moore usually has a more athletic quarterback. So I do think somebody like Jackson Dart makes a lot of sense for them. Now, maybe I don't know if they would necessarily want to take him at 9. I think most people would consider that a reach. But I guess if you love him, it doesn't matter what pick you have. So it all depends. It'll come down to whether or not they really love Jackson Dart or not. But I just thought with Kellen Moore's offense and the quarterbacks he prototypically uses, they've always kind of been more athletic, where Shedeur is more of a pocket passer.
I don't disagree with you when it comes to Dart. I think that he does fit more of what Kellen Moore likes to do. They've been a lot of comparisons to Dart being more like a Jalen Hurts type of player because of his running ability and as well as his ability to kind of go outside the pocket and make some unorthodox throws. I think that Jackson Dart is a better fit for what Kellen Moore wants to do instead of a Shedeur Sanders. So I actually agree with your logic because, Kellen Moore does a lot of play action and Jackson Dart was phenomenal in play action. I just think that, and I'm not going to let the cat out of the bag, so you're going to have to see what happens. But I think that if the Saints are going to, I do think that would be the quarterback that they would target of the quarterbacks available. I just think it wouldn't be now, and I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, which totally makes sense. Like I said, I mean, I don't know if it is at 9 or not, but I think Dart to the Saints makes sense, especially everything that they've got going on with Derek Carr. Unless there's people in the building that really like Spencer Rattler, which I know there was a time last year they really did, but it's also new head coach in there, offensive guy, and he might want a different guy to work with.
So my thoughts on Golden is, I think the Saints, they don't know what's going on with Chris Olave. They've got Rashid Shaheed, but he should be a free agent here shortly, and they've got Brandon Cooks. Golden is a pure speed guy, and ultimately you've been hearing a ton of buzz about this guy being, possibly the number one receiver taken in this draft. Now, what's interesting, and it depends. Some teams like to throw you off on this type of stuff, but I thought it was interesting that the Saints had a top 30 visit with him and a private dinner with Matthew Golden. In my mind, you're not having a private dinner with somebody if you don't think that you're strongly considering them. So I think at the end of the day, the Saints are kind of a wild card. I think they could really go in a lot of different directions. They were one of the teams I had a harder time pinpointing where I wanted them to go. Ultimately, I kind of was trying to not go chalk, and I was trying to go outside the box. I felt this might make sense.
Yeah, the Saints were one of the toughest teams for me as well, just because it's like they're in such a bad state, like
They really are.
organizationally and like against the salary cap, like they are, and they just have a lot of aging players, and yet they're just in a rebuilding team in a rebuild mode too. So just like you said, they really need everything. So it was kind of hard to mock something there, but to me, if Kellen Moore loves the quarterback, he'll take him.
Yeah, so we both had Tyler Warren at 10. Ben Johnson was interviewed and how talked about how dynamic Tyler Warren was. We saw what he was able to do with the Sam Laporta. He can now do 12 personnel with Tyler Warren and Cole Kmet. This just seems like a slam dunk for the Chicago Bears. Makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, especially, I know a lot of people might have them going like offensive line or whatever, but they kind of they revamped the offensive line in free agency. So by them doing that, they can really go best player available, and Tyler Warren will be a nice luxury to have. And like you mentioned, I mean, he really likes to utilize the tight ends and had Laporta in Detroit. So next best thing, get Tyler Warren in there with Kmet as well.
For 49ers, you had Will Johnson. I had Walter Nolan. For me, with Walter Nolan, you look at the interior defensive line group, it's pretty ravaged. I mean, they lost Javon Hargrave, who was the big anchor of that defense. I mean, they've got guys like Kevin Givens, but we're not talking a lot of talent up there. This is a guy who more and more you're hearing is a riser, and he's a hot player. Felt like this is probably where he might end up going. So felt like it made sense. Will Johnson also is a position of need. Cornerback is, for the Niners. So I could see why he went that way as well.
Yeah, I mean they were kind of another tough team for me just because they have a lot of needs. I think they will go defense, just a matter of like you said, will they address the defensive line, which they you've seen them do in the past. They've taken a lot of first round defensive linemen, not necessarily all worked out for them, but they have addressed that position. But I just think no more Travarius Ward. Will Johnson's there. He's a really good zone cornerback. He's not a guy that'll play a ton of man-to-man. That's one of his weaknesses. So I think with Salah's scheme going over there, I think he's the perfect fit at the cornerback position for them.
Lastly, we had America's team, the Dallas Cowboys. You went with Gray Zabel. I was a little surprised by that. I mean, he is a guy out of North Dakota that is an interesting player, but I've not seen him mock this high. So what made you? I mean, there's Calvin Banks still out there, Josh Simmons, some other offensive linemen out there, but you went with Zabel.
Yeah, just because I think losing Zach Martin due to retirement, I think they need to fix the interior part of their line. And the Cowboys just don't seem to be making those flashy picks anymore, with maybe reaching at the running backs or the wide receiver positions. So, and, listening to, I know Daniel Jeremiah talked about like that Stephen Jones interview, and maybe they do something boring. I think they also would like to trade down from there. Not sure if anyone wants to trade up to that pick. Ultimately, I thought maybe about doing a trade with the Eagles, but then I'm like, I don't know how many in-division trades there would be on draft night. So ultimately just gave him the interior offensive lineman, and Zabel, he's a very interesting player in the interior offensive line there.
Yeah, I went with Omarion Hampton because I think when I watch him, he reminds me of DeMarco Murray, former Dallas Cowboy.
Yeah, I remember you saying that before.
Jerry Jones got absolutely just lambasted by the media saying, why didn't you sign Derrick Henry, and why didn't you sign these people? And he had to eat crow the whole season. I think he's done with that. So to me, I could very much see him making Cowboys can be a little bit, they have been boring of late. Honestly, their draft picks have been pretty pitiful. So I could see them kind of, I don't think they have the best judgment. So I could definitely see them making a move like this. It's kind of an erratic decision. Not that Hampton isn't a good player. I think it'd be a little high. But I went on a limb here, and I felt like, okay, which team could maybe do a little something kind of outlandish? I'm like, it's the Cowboys.
Yeah. Hey, if there's any team to do it, I mean, it would be them. I mean, they, like you said, their front office is very questionable. The Cowboys were kind of another tough team for me to mark somebody, obviously think about receiver, running back position, but ultimately went offensive line for myself there.
Going over to our next bundle here at number 13 with the Miami Dolphins. What do you have there?
Yeah, at 13 with the Dolphins, I went with offensive tackle Kelvin Banks Jr. out of Texas.
All right. For me, for the Dolphins, I went with cornerback Will Johnson out of Michigan. How about the Colts at number 14?
Yeah, but the Colts had them getting tight end Colston Loveland out of Michigan.
I also went with tight end Colston Loveland out of Michigan for the Colts. How about number 15 for the Atlanta Falcons?
Hey, Atlanta Falcons, I went with defensive tackle Walter Nolan, Ole Miss.
Okay, so this is my first trade in the mock draft. I have the Atlanta Falcons trading back with the Seattle Seahawks. So they go from 15 to 18, and the Seahawks take wide receiver Tataroa McMillan out of Arizona.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. And last but not least, in this bundle, number 16 with the Arizona Cardinals.
Yeah, Arizona Cardinals, I went with defensive end Mike Green out of Marshall.
All right. I also went with the defensive end, but not Mike Green. I went with Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M. All right. So starting off with the Miami Dolphins here, you end up going with Kelvin Banks Jr. I was considering that as well. I think the Dolphins are either going to go offensive tackle or cornerback because we've been hearing rumors of Jalen Ramsey is going to get traded. And if you look at it, I think their other cornerback is like Storm Duck or something like that. So, I mean, they to me, those are their two positions of need, and there is value on the board there.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, obviously, I've got Will Johnson already taken the 49ers there. Defense makes sense, but I think ultimately they really need to look to reassure that offensive line and really be able to protect two or better. And obviously, Armstead retiring too didn't help. So I ended up going with Kelvin Banks.
Yeah, I think it's a good pick. Like I said, I feel very strongly it's either corner or offensive tackle. Maybe they do something like Matthew Goins on the board because of that speed and they just can't help themselves. But I think that. I think my guess, that's like the wild card situation. My guess is it's going to be one of the two that we talked about. 14, we went Colston Loveland. This is a drop in the bucket for the Colts. Their tight end room is probably the worst in the league, maybe. Having a guy like Loveland could really help either Anthony Richardson or Daniel Jones.
Yeah, 100%. They've had some interesting guys at tight end, just hasn't necessarily worked out there. So having the opportunity to draft, Tyler Warner, Colston Loveland, I think they'll jump at that opportunity.
At number 15 with the Falcons, I end up having the first trade with the Seattle Seahawks coming up. I think my feeling on this is this is an interesting class or draft, I should say, not a class yet. Because every team has their own first-round pick. Usually you have a team that has multiple first-round picks. This is the first time that it hasn't been the case. So will you see less trades going on? There maybe aren't as many blue-chip players. Maybe there's more depth in this class. But I think the Falcons at 15 will trade. It's a prime spot that I will be watching as the draft goes on. If you look at the Falcons, they only have 5 total picks in this draft. They have a first-round pick at number 15, a second-round pick, a fourth-round pick, and 2 7s. So that's not a lot of picks. That's one of the fewest. So to me, they're going to want to recoup capital. Tataroa McMillan, you look at a guy like John Snyder, the GM from the Seahawks. He's a trader. He's known for trading. So in my mind, I'm looking at general managers who aren't afraid to do wheel and deal. So McMillan, this is right around the range where I think he could start to go. And they just left. DK Metcalf's no longer on the roster. They want to have that big X receiver. They've got Cooper Kupp. Now they brought him in. They've also got Jackson Smith and Jigba. Really provides a lot of firepower on that offense. So I just felt like it's a move where Seahawks could afford it, but then Falcons just slide a little bit back. So I think I would be surprised if Atlanta will take calls. Doesn't mean that they'll necessarily do a trade, but I would be kind of surprised if the Falcons don't trade.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think I could see them trading, and like you said, especially due to the lack of the picks, I guess it's just is there somebody on the board that teams want to trade up for? I think that's one of the hardest things that I've had and kind of juggled. Just, you mentioned the depth in this draft is there. So it's just like, I don't know. I do think, Ted McMillan to the Seahawks is interesting. Hadn't necessarily heard that, but obviously, you get Sam Darnold in there, and then it's like, now, you give away DK Metcalf, and then it's like, all right, I know you bring in Cooper Kupp, you have Jackson Smith and Jake, but it's like, who else is he going to be throwing the ball to?
Yeah, and you went with Walter Nolan, replacing now Grady Jarrett, who left in free agency, went to Chicago.
Yep, you mentioned it. I mean, that was my ideal there, just to kind of replace that interior defensive line fit there, and then Nolan's also, just an exciting player and provides that sack upside that Grady Jarrett also provided as well.
Lastly, at number 16 for the Cardinals, you went Mike Green. I went Shamar Stewart. I think they're going to go edge. I really do. I know other, whatever you want to call it, draft analysts, different like mock draft databases will tell you that they have other positions of need. I think they are really going to address the edge spot. I was back and forth between whether it's Mike Green or Shamar Stewart or Micah Williams. I was really couldn't figure it out. Ultimately, I went with Stewart because I think Jonathan Gannon really prioritizes that versatility. And I think Stewart, he could use more as a chess piece. Whereas I don't know if Mike Green or Micah Williams, you get that as much. So I ended up going with Stewart. But what was your logic on Mike Green for the Cardinals?
Yeah, at the end of the day, I just was kind of, I wanted to give them an edge rusher and just kind of was going based on who I thought was the best edge rusher left on the board. And to me, that was Mike Green. And I think if you just look on, based on his production, he was very productive this past season with Marshall, and ultimately decided, to give him to the Cardinals there.
All right, so going over to our next bundle, starting off with the Bengals at 17. Who do you got there?
And with the Bengals, I've got them going with linebacker Jihad Campbell out of Alabama.
All right, for me at number 17, I went with Mike Green, edge rusher out of Marshall, heading to the Bengals. How about number 18 for the Seattle Seahawks?
At 18 with the Seahawks, I got them going offensive guard Donovan Jackson out of Ohio State.
Okay, for me, this is obviously a trade, so the Falcons are picking, and they're going with edge rusher Micah Williams out of Georgia. So heading over to number 19 for the Tampa Bay Bucks. Who do you got there?
Yeah, 19 with the Bucks, I went with defensive end Donovan Ezeraku out of Boston College.
Interesting. All right, I went with linebacker Jihad Campbell out of Alabama, heading to the Buccaneers. And last but not least, Joe, in this bundle, your Denver Broncos. Who do you have the Broncos taking?
Yep, I've got the Broncos going with wide receiver Emeka Egbuka out of Ohio State.
Interesting. All right, well, fasten your seatbelt on this one, Joe. I'm throwing you a curveball. I'm going to go with running back Travion Henderson out of Ohio State. So, first off, starting with the Bengals at 17, not too far off. You had Mike Green at 16. I had him at 17. This is a dream spot, I think, for the Bengals. They need some pass rush help across from Trey Hendrickson. Felt like I think edge rusher, they need to address it, especially with Sam Hubbard's retirement. So I felt like that made sense for them. But you went with Jihad Campbell.
Yeah, I went with Jihad Campbell. Obviously he has a lot of versatility, really good blitzing guy, but I just think they needed to get some help at the linebacker position. And I think he's somebody that, given his versatility, they could bring him off of the edge as well. But just playing in a, division with teams like, Ravens, the Steelers, going to have to stop, big running backs in the hole. And then I think Campbell's even a guy you can use out there. Maybe you have him spying Lamar Jackson as well. So based on his speed and some of his versatility, I think that makes sense. Obviously, I thought edge or defensive line as well, just because that's where they're weak. But I think Campbell can help them still kind of with the rushing the passer, but then also give him some versatility to do some other things with his athleticism.
At number 18, for me, it was the Falcons. I went with Micah Williams. I think this makes sense for the Falcons. They trade back. They collect some picks. I think they need an edge rusher desperately. They did sign Leonard Floyd. They've been needing a pass rusher for the longest time. So to me, I think Micah Williams makes a ton of sense for them. Now, you went with Donovan Jackson for the Seahawks.
Yeah, I think the Seahawks need to upgrade their offense line, and especially in the interior. I would have went with Zabel had I not have gone with him to the Cowboys. So Donovan Jackson, I just thought next best thing there at the guard position. And, kind of saw it when protection wears down, Sam Darnold's not the best. So they got to figure out a way to keep him upright. So, it starts with the interior protection.
All right, for number 19, obviously I went with Campbell. He's an interest. I think this is a perfect landing spot for him. I've been pairing him with the Buccaneers all the time. Levante David, how much longer does he have? Maybe a year left. He then replaces him as the middle of that defense. Now, the thing is, they did say that he's had some injury concerns, I believe, with his shoulder. So, when you hear stuff like that, it's like, oh, is this guy going to be available in the second round? Is it going to be an entire slide? I wouldn't be surprised based on stuff I've just, watching the draft for so many years as I have. That happens all the time.
Like a Nakobe Dean situation. Everyone's saying he's a first round pick, and then some medicals pop up, and what do you know? He's out of the first round.
Oh, absolutely. So that could very well happen with the guy. You went with Donovan Ezeraku, which is interesting because you still have Micah Williams on the board, but end up going with Ezeraku.
Yeah, I just think Ezeraku and what he does, I think he fits what the from the defensive end position, what the Buccaneers are looking to do. And I think he just fits really well in their system. So ultimately went with Ezeraku over some other guys. And I know he needs to, figure out the run a little bit, but he's just got so many different pass rush moves, and I think it makes sense there.
Lastly, your Denver Broncos. I'll let you speak on this first. Maybe you've got some inside knowledge on your thoughts on Agabuka, but I know you'd be pretty happy if this was the pick.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I'd be happy with either of our picks here, mainly just because it's not Omarion Hampton. But I just, more I just keep hearing about Egbuka and how much teams just really like him, and how smart he is. And he's not the flashiest guy, but he's just really solid. He's a really good route runner. He's dependable. And I think that's just exactly what the Broncos are missing, is just somebody that's going to be dependable on those third downs and be able to move the chains.
So here's my twisted logic when it comes to TreVeyon Henderson with the Broncos. This feels very, and I do think this does come with the territory where I think Sean Payton's quite arrogant, but he sat and just waited patiently. He knew that Bo Nix was his guy, and he didn't have to move up for him, and he just fell right into his lap, right? And he knew that this is who he wanted. He could play. He played the board well. I think this is a similar situation. I think even if Omarion Hampton was on the board, I think they would go with TreVeyon Henderson. He's the best pass protector in this draft. He gives them that type of burst, and I think kind of that Joker element that ultimately is what Sean Payton's looking for. So I actually think my sneaky suspicion is I think that he feels like I'm just going to wait and hold pat, and I'm going to get the guy I want. So to me, probably TreVeyon Henderson has not been a guy who's been often mocked in the first round, but neither was Bo Nix last year. And I don't think Sean Payton is afraid of whatever, whatever backlash he may get. He's going to do what he wants to do, and he thinks he's going to right. And hey, you know what? I can't blame him for last year. I thought he was nuts, but he proved me wrong. So I think it could make a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, honestly, I would love TreVeyon Henderson to the Broncos. I think it does make a ton of sense. And I think what really could solidify him is just the fact that, I keep hearing guys, especially, Daniel Jeremiah and Joe Klatt, were just talking about his pass protection ability. And that's something that they lost with Javonte Williams. Javonte Williams was one of the best third down pass protectors in the league. He's now in Dallas. So how do you replace that? Henderson with that ability plus his receiving ability, that would make a lot of sense.
All right, so we're on to 21 with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Who do you got there?
All right, with the Steelers, I went with quarterback Shedeur Sanders out of Colorado.
All right, I went with defensive tackle Derek Harmon out of Oregon. And now 22 for the LA Chargers.
Yeah, with the Chargers, I went with defensive tackle Kenneth Grant out of Michigan.
I also went with defensive tackle Kenneth Grant out of Michigan, reuniting with Jim Harbaugh. How about number 23 for the Green Bay Packers?
Yep, 23. I went with defensive end Shamar Stewart out of Texas A&M.
All right, I went with offensive tackle Josh Simmons out of Ohio State. And last but not least, we're at number 24 with the Minnesota Vikings.
Yep, 24 with the Vikings. I went with safety Nick Emenwari out of South Carolina.
All right, I got another trade, Joe. The Minnesota Vikings are no longer in the pick. and they are going to be trading with the Cleveland Browns. And the Cleveland Browns will be selecting quarterback Shedeur Sanders. So number 21, Pittsburgh Steelers. I'll go first because probably most people are kind of surprised. I opted for them not to go with the quarterback here. I think that Aaron Rodgers, I think that he will be going to the Steelers at this point. I know the logic is that he's going to retire, but he plays with the media all the time. And I think at the end of the day, even if they don't, I think that they could take a quarterback later in the draft. I think Derek Harmon is, and they say they're comfortable with Mason Rudolph, is what they say.
Yeah,
So
that's what they say.
I get that, but Harmon, he comes alongside a guy like Cameron Hayward. He's got great pass rushing ability, fits kind of what I think the Steelers are looking for. I thought it made too much sense to go with Harmon. I know everybody thinks quarterback for the Steelers, and it very well could be the case. I thought about it a lot with what you're doing with Sanders being at 21 because the same thing happened with Pickett. Just fell right into their lap. I didn't have to move anything at all, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think if they had a second round pick, I'd feel differently. But the fact that they don't have a second round pick and they don't pick again till the third round, I think that makes it really tough to address the quarterback position later. So I think I was very close to having like Browns or Giants trade with the Broncos and jump them. Ultimately, decided not to do that and just have Sanders fall into the Steelers' lap here. But I do think if Sanders is there, that or maybe even Jackson Dart at that point, one of the two, I think they will take a quarterback. Just like I said, because I think the third round will be too late at that point.
That's a really interesting point. I didn't even realize that nugget there, Joe. That was very interesting in watching them because they don't have that second. What do they end up doing? That's very interesting.
Yeah, I believe their next pick would be at pick 81. So that's just a really long time.
Yeah, 83, close.
83. Though. I knew it was in the 80s.
How about the LA Chargers? This was a team that I honestly had a lot of difficulty deciding who to pick. Looks like you did as well.
Yeah.
I ultimately ended up going with the familiarity with Kenneth Grant. You know, we know that Jim Harbaugh is a big believer in building up the trenches, and they have Tier Tart as their nose tackle. Kenneth Grant would easily replace him as the starter there, so I felt like Grant made sense. But I didn't feel great about it, honestly.
Yeah, I don't feel great about it either. But I also, if I didn't have Kenneth Grant going to the Chargers here, I know he's gonna. I think he'll go somewhere in the first round, and then it was hard for me to slot him somewhere else. But then, yes, Chargers are another tough team. I feel like they could do a lot of different things, but I just feel like, you know, with the continuity he could have with Jim Harbaugh, like you said, they like to build in the trenches. I think grabbing his Michigan guy, Kenneth Grant, I know it's somebody that he really likes, along with Jesse Minter, who's their defensive coordinator. They both really like him. So it was just too good for me to pass up putting Grant with the Chargers there.
I was very close to doing Jahdae Barron because Asante Samuel is no longer there. Maybe they use him as like a Swiss Army knife, but ultimately, Harbaugh just is a big believer in the D-line, so I went there. For the Packers, you went with Shamar Stewart. I went with Josh Simmons. There's been a lot of rumors of Michael Williams going there. He is falling on your board, Joe, but you went with Stewart.
Yeah, I ended up going with Shamar Stewart. Obviously he's a really interesting guy. Athleticism jumped off the board at the combine. So I just think with that and, the Green Bay Packers, I know people might want them to take a wide receiver. They just don't do that. Typically grab guys out of the SEC. So ultimately I put Shamar Stewart here.
Yeah. With Josh Simmons, I was very close going with Calvin Banks, but they've been having some top 30 visits with Josh Simmons. I think Banks, some believe that maybe he should be a guard, not a tackle. I think Simmons, sometimes it's just based on what they like in a player. It could go either way there. I also think they could go edge like you did. But in this situation, in my mock, those guys are gone. So I went with Simmons. And then lastly, at 24, you went with safety Nick Emmanwori, I'm assuming replacing Cam Bynum.
Yep. But I mean, obviously he does a lot of other things as well and just gives another toy for Brian Flores to play with in Minnesota. And I'd be excited to see how he utilizes them.
Okay. Mark my words. I think the Vikings are going to trade. The Vikings have the least amount of draft picks in this draft with 4 total draft picks, a first-round pick, a third-round pick, a fifth, and a sixth. That's low. They want to replenish that capital. And the NFL is all about who you know. And at the end of the day, Kevin Stefanski came from Minnesota and now is in Cleveland. So there's familiarity, between those two teams. And I think it makes a lot of sense that, and I try to think about that. I do think that trades sometimes happen because of that familiarity. It doesn't have to happen that way, but I do think it happens quite a bit. And so I think I'm a believer that the Browns want Shedeur Sanders and Travis Hunter. I think they want both of them. I think they want that to be the identity of their team moving forward, and I think they're going to do everything in their power to make it happen. So I think Sanders fits more of what Stefanski likes. Stefanski likes those accurate quarterback, quick processor. He's not looking for the big flashy arm. And honestly, he's had this with Deshaun Watson. Not to say a big flashy arm, but this kind of Houdini type who tries to make something out of nothing, and it really hasn't worked. Sanders fits more of the mold. Now, who knows if Dion would like him going to Cleveland, but I think, honestly, with Travis Hunter going there, that kind of, cuts the edge off it a little bit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you in the fact that, like, if there's any, out of like the Browns and the Giants, I do think the Browns would be the ones that trade back into the first round for Shedeur Sanders. Just like you said, he fits really what Stefanski wants to do really well. But ultimately, it's interesting. The Browns and the Giants both have the ammunition. They have a ton of picks. They both have around the same picks as well in terms of like, the extra third round picks that they could really offer some teams. So it'll be interesting to see which team wants to be aggressive and do they ultimately trade it back into the first round to grab one of these guys.
All right, so head over to our next bundle here, 25 through 28, starting off with the Texans at 25. Who do you got there?
Yeah, the 25th pick, I've got them going with Josh Simmons, offensive tackle, Ohio State.
I also have them going with an offensive tackle, but it's Kelvin Banks Jr. out of Texas. How about the Rams at 26?
Yeah, Rams were a tough one for me. I really feel like they could go a lot of different ways, but ultimately decided to go with cornerback Trey Amos out of Ole Miss.
I also went with a quarterback, but went a different direction as you. I went with Jahdae Barron out of Texas for the Rams. How about number 27 for the Ravens?
All right, 27, I got them going with safety Malachi Starks out of Georgia.
All right, I went with offensive guard Tyler Booker out of Alabama. And how about the Detroit Lions at 28?
Yeah, at 28 with the Lions, I went with defensive end Nick Scorton out of Texas A&M.
All right. Well, I went with offensive guard Gray Zabel out of North Dakota State. You and I both went with the same logic there for the Texans, going with an offensive tackle. It just so happens that I had Banks on the board and you had Simmons on the board. But I think they need to have protection for C.J. Stroud, and I think that's where they're going to go.
Yep, I completely agree. I mean, I obviously had Banks going earlier, so Josh Simmons, top tackle on the board at that point. So, but I definitely agree with you. I think, if you look at the protection, just wasn't good, and interesting. They trade Tunsil, but I think that just showed you they wanted to get younger and just go with a new direction on the offensive line.
Yeah, you alluded to the Rams being difficult. I also thought they were difficult. I think they could go a variety of different ways. And the rumor has been that they might go quarterback, but I feel like they did that last year too. And I don't, maybe one of these days they'll do it, but I'm not that much of a believer. I went with Barron because I felt like they could use a cornerback, and it sounds like you thought so as well.
Yeah, honestly, I was very close to putting Milroe here.
Interesting.
Just because, you keep hearing the latest buzz. Like Milroe is going to go in the first round some way, somehow, because, he got invited to the draft. He accepted it. So everyone's thinking he's going to the first round. And I just think it could be interesting. Matthew Stafford's not getting any younger. McVay could potentially, groom Milroe. But ultimately, he decided to go cornerback here. Gave him Trey Amos, and guy that is kind of rising of late. And people are saying he could be the best corner in this draft.
For number 27, I went with Tyler Booker, not a flashy pick by any means, the offensive guard, but I've heard them linked very strongly to Baltimore. And so that I might have zeroed in on that too quickly. But that seems like a chalky type pick from what I'm hearing. So at the end of the day, I went there, but I could totally see Malachi Starks. I mean, Ardarius Washington, I think he accepted his RFA tender. He'll be a free agent. So could definitely see why they pick him here.
Yeah, ultimately, just felt like this would be such a Baltimore Ravens pick, and talented safety ultimately falls to him. They got Kyle Hamilton there. You mentioned Darius Washington, but getting a guy like Malachi Starks, I feel like would just give them a lot more versatility in that secondary and be able to, move some guys around.
Now you've got Nick Scorton in 28. Micah Williams continues to fall in the Joe mock draft over here. Thoughts on Scorton?
Yeah, I just feel like Scorton and just like his traits, I feel like, and his personality, I just feels like he is a Detroit Lion player to me.
Even
just
ahead of James Pierce, though?
Yeah, because like Pierce is that
Interesting.
flashy like edge rusher. Like Scorton's that like tough guy. He's very talented as well. Can do a lot of things. He also can play the run, and I feel like that's going to be a priority. So I just feel like that he's more the type of Lions player with his personality, but could totally see them deciding to go with a different edge rusher to pair across with Hutchinson there.
Yeah, I end up going with Zerbal. I think that they really need interior offensive line help quite desperately. Glasnow is not getting any old or any younger, and the opposite guard is not in good shape. So to me, Zerbal makes a ton of sense for them as they want to continue to beef up that offensive line.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't surprise me. Obviously, I got Zabel going a lot earlier, but wouldn't surprise me.
Way earlier, yeah.
If Dan Campbell would, address the offensive line and get those guys tougher up front.
All right, so we'll get into our last bundle here, 29 through 32, starting off with the Washington Commanders. Who do you got there?
Yep, the Commanders at 29. Here you go, Steve. Defensive end, Mykel Williams out of Georgia.
Okay, finally he comes off the board. I went with, now I thought very strongly about a trade. Again, team only has 5 picks. Adam Peters, is a guy who I think is willing to move up and down the board. I ended up having them stick and go with safety Nick Ammanwori out of South Carolina. How about I just let the cat out of the bag here. About the Bills? Who do you got the?
Well, with your Buffalo Bills, Steve, I think you'll be happy about this one. I've got them getting wide receiver Matthew Golden out of Texas.
Wow, that's a very interesting pick. Well, I kind of let the cat out of the bag with my what I'm saying here. I have the Bills trading out of this pick here, going to the New York Giants. I have the Giants taking quarterback Jalen Milroe.
Interesting.
And then at number 31, who do you got for the Kansas City Chiefs?
Yeah, the Chiefs, tough team to what to do here, but ultimately went with offensive tackle Josh Connerly out of Oregon.
I thought about taking him as well, but I ended up going with safety Malachi Starks out of Georgia. And last but not least, the Super Bowl champion Philadelphia Eagles. Who do you have there?
Yep, with the Eagles, I went with defensive tackle Derek Harmon out of Oregon.
All right, I ended up going with defensive end James Pierce Jr. out of Tennessee. All right, so starting off here with the Washington Commanders. This is a tough one. Like I said, I really thought about doing a trade here, but the team I was thinking mostly was the New York Giants. But I'm like, are you going to have an interdivision trade where the Giants come up to the, with the Commanders? I was like, I don't think so. Like, do the Saints possibly come up for a quarterback? But I'm like, yeah, maybe. I don't know. I ended up having them stick because, they lost Jeremy Chin. And you got a guy like Nick Ammanwori, who I think is very reminiscent of Camp Chancellor, a guy who, back in the day, Dan Quinn, was involved in that Seahawks defense, Legion of Boom. Felt like that could make a lot of sense for them, bringing in a guy like him. So I ended up going with Ammanwori. You went with Mykel Williams.
Yeah, Ammanwori is an interesting pick. I think potentially a good fit there with Washington, and I think I could definitely see that happening. But yeah, finally, Steve, you were wondering about Mykel Williams. Finally got it coming off the board with
the slide is finally gone.
Slide is finally gone, and he's I think he's the best fit with a 4-3 team. It's exactly what the Commanders are, and they need some help on the edge.
And then you went with Matthew Golden for the Bills, which is very interesting that he's lasted this long, considering all the buzz he's gotten.
Yeah, I mean, he has gotten a lot of buzz, but ultimately, I didn't have the Cowboys taking him. Just struggled to find another spot for him until now. I mean, I remember it's something that you said during one of the videos here that we've done in the past, mentioning how the Bills wanted that speedy receiver. Well, who else but Matthew Golden, who ran the 4.29 40, gives them an extra dimension on the outside to go along with K.N. Coleman.
Just interesting how they pass up another Texas receiver and Xavier Worthy, and then ended up going back and picking Golden. I think he definitely brings a speed element to the offense that the Bills are missing, and so I could see that it would be more of a luxury pick, but ultimately could definitely see them going this direction with going with Golden.
Yeah, I thought about, defensive line, almost slotted them with Derek Harmon, honestly, to bolster that. But ultimately, just think Golden would be very interesting. And to me, he got more route running and more of a complete receiver than how I viewed Worthy last year.
And this situation for me with the Bills, they have a lot of picks, and I struggle with them. I thought that, I looked at possibly do they trade up to get more of a blue chip player because they have an extra second round pick. Ultimately, I opted not to, and I ended up having them trade back, which I would think that maybe some would think I'm kind of nuts because ultimately, I did last year, but they don't have a third though. And if they just trade back, back with the Giants, who are, I believe, the second pick in the second round, they may be able to pick up that third rounder, and you get a second. You only move a couple picks back, and you get that third rounder back. So I just think at the end of the day, Brandon Beane is not scared to trade. There's familiarity with that front office. You got Joe Shane and Brian Daboll, who used to be with the Bills. So I try to think about that as far as familiarity goes. With the Bills' sake, honestly, the board is absolutely ravished. I think, they would have wanted a guy, like a Kenneth Grant at defensive tackle, maybe a guy like Derek Harmon, Walter Nolan. They're all off the board. Could do a guy like an edge rusher like a James Pierce, but all those other guys, Michael Williams, Shamar Stewart, Mike Green, they're all gone. So to me, it's like, well, what are the Bills going to do? Matthew Golden in my scenario is gone. So it's like, maybe they go with a Maxwell Harrison on a Kentucky. Maybe they go with a Trey Amos. It's possible at Ole Miss. I could see maybe going that route. Ultimately, I ended up going to trading down because I think Milroe has to get drafted in the first round. I think there's no way he's not going to the draft if a team basically came up to him and said, "Look, we are going to move up into the first and pick you." I just can't see why he would go otherwise. To me, it just seems like it's got to happen.
Yeah, no, that's what I struggled with. I know I didn't make it happen in mine, but I do think it potentially would not shock me if it ends up happening on draft night, just because he did accept it. I guess, though, I could definitely see the Bills trading back. I guess I don't know if the Giants would just do this because if they really wanted Milroe, I think they could just grab him with their second round pick.
Well, I think there'd be the thought of the fear of somebody else coming up and getting him. I think that you've got, for Milroe, I think it makes sense. I think you've got the Alabama connection, with, Brian Daboll used to be there. I think that, he's definitely a raw quarterback, but he's kind of a project. But, he could be like a Jalen Hurts type of player, and he can sit behind Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston and not have to worry about it. So, to me, I think Milroe makes a lot of sense for the Giants. I think of all the teams, honestly, I think he makes his pairing with the Giants makes the most sense of the quarterback needy teams, which is New York Giants, Cleveland Browns, and New Orleans Saints.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. I definitely could see the Giants. I do think they are the most likely team to take the flyer and take the shot on them.
At 31, you went with Josh Connolly Jr. I thought about that as well because obviously the offensive line for the Chiefs was an absolute sieve in the Super Bowl. I ended up going with Starks. I felt like he was worthy of a first-round pick. He's got that, that playmaking ability in the back end, and they really only have Brian Cook. They lost Justin Reed in free agency, so it felt like Starks made a lot of sense for the Chiefs.
Yeah, ultimately, I went with tackle. You mentioned it, just they couldn't block anybody in the Super Bowl. That was, main reason they lost that game. Just they couldn't control the trenches. So getting an offensive tackle will help them do that. And honestly, like the depth is on the defensive side. So I feel like if they didn't go tackle in the first round, then the guys you're looking at in the second round for offensive line position just continue to decrease from there.
Lastly, with the Eagles, you went with Derek Harmon. I went with James Pierce. I could definitely see him going defensive line. Ultimately, Pierce, is very similar to a guy like Josh Sweat, who they just lost in free agency, a guy who can have a really dynamic speed rush. He may have some character issues, but I'm sure Howie won't care about that. I did think about maybe the Eagles trade up because Howie loves the trade, but in this situation, there's a lot of depth here. Didn't see any reason for him to trade. All the quarterbacks have been taken in my mind, other than Jackson Dart. Obviously did not have him begin taken in the first round, which might be somewhat of a surprise. I do think that I think 3 quarterbacks get taken. I just don't know which one. I think it could be Milroe. It definitely Cam Ward, but then I think it's Dart Milroe or Dart Shador or Shador Milroe. I went with Shador Milroe.
Right. I think that makes sense. I do think the Eagles would like to trade up. They have a ton of picks, and you hear the fact that the GM just doesn't feel like there's only like 15 players worthy of first round picks. So I wouldn't be surprised if on draft night Eagles trade up into the top 15. I just didn't know which teams would potentially make sense as a trade partner. But ultimately, I think, if they do stick and pick and a guy like Derek Harmon falls to them, they'll take him. And obviously they're looking to replace Milton Williams.
So before we close out this episode here, we thought it was interesting. We did allow for trades. You opted not to do any trades, Joe. What was the reason there? I had 3 trades. You had Zippo.
Yeah. Like I said, it was just tough for me to figure out different trade partners. I did think about some trades. But ultimately last year I was looking at my mock. I had way too many just trades last year. Didn't work out for me. So I just decided to have teams kind of stick and pick. And I know, no one's mock's going to be 100%, and you're not going to get everything right. So if trades happen, they happen. I just went with, teams sticking and picking who I thought they might take if they do.
So that does it for this episode. We went through our first round mock draft, Joe and mine. There's going to be a lot of mock drafts coming out, so I'm sure you could be comparing ours to everybody else's, but it's an exciting time as we kind of speculate what's going to happen. So it's pretty exciting. If you haven't done so already, check out one of our most recent episodes where we went through Dynasty IDP rankings for these rookies pre-NFL draft. When these guys go there, it's going to change the game, but we went through just based on their talent. So you want to check that out. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time.